December 16, 1944. The Ardennes forest stood silent, its trees weighed down by heavy snow. The cold bit into the air with the kind of stillness that only comes before disaster. For weeks, the Allies had grown complacent. They thought Germany was finished, its armies shattered, its cities burning, its morale broken. But deep inside the frozen woods, something stirred. Engines rumbled. Orders were whispered in guttural German. Men painted black crosses over captured American tanks. In the stillness before dawn, the largest German counterattack of the Western Front began. The Battle of the Bulge, Hitler's final gamble. If it succeeded, he would split the Allied armies, seize Antwerp, and force the Western powers into a separate peace. And yet, beneath the roar of the tanks and the thunder of artillery, another weapon moved unseen. Not a battalion, not a tank, but a handful of men. Ghosts wearing stolen uniforms. They would drive American jeeps, speak English, and spread confusion everywhere they went. They were soldiers without flags, the invisible vanguard of chaos. To the Germans, this was a clever trick. To the Allies, it was treachery. To history, it would become a story of cunning and irony. Because in the end, these infiltrators would be defeated not by guns, but by baseball.
Hitler's Gambit, Operation Greif. In November 1944, as Allied bombers flattened German cities, Hitler summoned a man he trusted above all others, a man whose name had already become legend, Otto Skorzeny. He was tall, scar-faced, charismatic, the kind of soldier who thrived on impossible missions. The world knew him as the man who rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison with gliders and a handful of commandos. To Hitler, he was his most daring officer. Now, Hitler wanted another miracle. He handed Skorzeny a new assignment, not to attack, but to deceive. The plan was codenamed Operation Greif, Griffin. Its purpose? To sow panic behind Allied lines during the coming Ardennes offensive. Skorzeny's commandos would wear captured American uniforms, use U.S. weapons and vehicles, and move through the front as if they were retreating Allied troops. Their tasks were deceptively simple. Change road signs and misdirect traffic. Cut communication lines. Spread false orders. Capture key bridges before they were destroyed. A few might even try to assassinate Allied commanders. Hitler believed this psychological blow could paralyze the enemy faster than artillery ever could. But there was a problem. The plan required men who could pass for Americans, who could sound American. And Germany didn't have many of those left. Skorzeny scoured the Wehrmacht for English speakers. He placed ads in military newspapers. Volunteers wanted for dangerous mission. Knowledge of English essential. Hundreds applied. Most were curious, some just wanted out of their current units. But as the interviews began, the grim reality set in. Many could read English. Some could even write it. But speaking it? Almost none could pass as native. After weeks of testing, Skorzeny found only 10 fluent English speakers. 10 men to impersonate the entire U.S. Army. The rest would memorize short phrases. Yes, sir. Okay, buddy. Right this way. Enough to bluff their way through a checkpoint before vanishing into the fog. They practiced relentlessly. They studied American slang, learned to smoke Lucky Strikes and chew gum, studied baseball scores, Hollywood actors, even the layout of American cities. To complete the illusion, Skorzeny's unit, the 150th Panzer Brigade, was equipped with captured U.S. vehicles, jeeps, trucks, and Sherman tanks repainted with white stars. They were to become shadows wearing the enemy's face. And in the cold dawn of December, they would drive straight into the heart of the Allied army.
The Infiltration. December 16th. The offensive began. The German artillery opened up with 1,600 guns. The ground shook, trees splintered. Men scrambled from their foxholes, stunned by the ferocity of the barrage. While the Americans braced for the attack, Skorzeny's commandos slipped through the smoke. They moved in small teams, 4 or 5 men to a jeep, dressed in crisp American uniforms, armed with M1 carbines and Thompsons. They carried fake papers, forged by the German intelligence service to perfection. In one sector, near Malmedy, a group waved cheerfully at real American troops as they passed. "Where are you boys headed?" someone shouted. "Bastogne," came the reply, in perfect English. No one suspected a thing. Behind enemy lines, they went to work. Road signs were flipped, bridges wired for demolition, phone lines cut, convoys redirected into ambushes. One team even convinced an entire tank column to turn around, sending it straight into German artillery fire. Rumors began to ripple through Allied command. German tanks were appearing in strange places. Units were reporting attacks from their own rear. Orders were getting lost or contradicted. Within hours, confusion spread faster than gunfire. By nightfall, panic was setting in. Messages from the front were frantic. "The enemy is everywhere. They're disguised as us." The Americans were fighting not only the Germans in front of them, but phantoms behind them. And in that chaos, trust began to crumble.
The Americans start to doubt each other. The first clue was confusion. A bridge that was supposed to be mined for demolition already destroyed. A convoy meant for Bastogne redirected toward German lines. And reports kept coming in. American jeeps behaving strangely. Checkpoints giving contradictory orders. Men who didn't quite sound right. At first, Allied commanders thought it was fatigue. The front was chaotic. The Ardennes a labyrinth of snow, mud, and broken roads. But soon, too many things went wrong to ignore. Somewhere in the middle of the fog and white forests, the enemy wasn't just attacking, he was pretending to be them. Word spread like a virus. German spies wearing American uniforms, imposters driving jeeps, saboteurs behind our lines. Soldiers began to whisper it around campfires and foxholes. In some units, paranoia hit like a fever. Who can you trust when the man next to you might be speaking English with a German tongue? At a checkpoint near Stavelot, a jeep rolled up carrying 4 GIs. They looked perfect. Dusty uniforms, helmets marked with 101st patches, cigarette smoke curling from the driver's mouth. They even had the right slang. "Mornin', fellas," one MP said, stepping forward. "Where you boys coming from?" "Malmedy. The roads are a mess up there. We're headed to Bastogne to reinforce." The MP nodded, then paused. Something about the driver's accent, the rhythm maybe, didn't sit right. "You guys heard the latest?" the MP asked casually. The driver frowned. "The latest what?" "The World Series. You know, baseball." The men exchanged confused glances. Yankees?" the driver ventured. The MP smiled thinly. "The Cardinals," he said quietly. "And you're under arrest." Within seconds, rifles were drawn. The impostors hesitated. One reached for his pistol, and the firefight ended before it began. 3 were dead. 1 captured. Under interrogation, the survivor broke quickly. He confessed they were German commandos under Otto Skorzeny's command, sent to infiltrate and sabotage. It wasn't just rumor anymore. The Americans were being hunted by men who looked exactly like them.
By the next morning, the entire front was on edge. MPs began setting up surprise checkpoints across Belgium and Luxembourg. Every jeep, every truck, every soldier on foot was stopped and questioned. No one was above suspicion. Generals were halted at gunpoint by their own men. Colonel Robert Murphy of the 101st Airborne was detained for an hour because he'd misremembered the capital of his own state. Even the commander of the 12th Army Group, General Omar Bradley, was stopped and questioned 3 times in one day. Bradley later joked that if he'd answered one question wrong, his own troops might have shot him. The MPs developed a system, the baseball test. Simple questions, but ones that only a true American would know instinctively. Who's the manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers? Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? What's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? For the German infiltrators, fluent though they were, this was their downfall. They could fake an accent, but not a lifetime of small talk. And so, one by one, they were caught. In the village of Iwale, another jeep rolled up to a checkpoint. 4 soldiers inside, all in American uniforms. They had perfect paperwork, perfect slang, and the easy confidence of men who belonged. "Where's your unit?" the MP asked. 106th Infantry. Just got pushed back from St. Vith. "All right," the MP said. "Quick one for you. Who's Joe DiMaggio play for?" The driver hesitated. Just a flicker, but enough. "Boston," he said. Wrong again. Within moments, the jeep was surrounded. The imposters realized the game was up. They surrendered quietly, knowing what awaited them. For the Americans, this was justice. For the Germans, it was a death sentence. Captured in enemy uniform, it meant execution as spies. But the paranoia didn't stop with the arrests. Rumors spread that Skorzeny himself was leading a team to assassinate General Eisenhower in Paris. Headquarters went into full lockdown. Eisenhower's movements became classified. Guards tripled. His convoy routes changed daily. The supreme commander of Allied forces was, for all practical purposes, a prisoner inside his own HQ. All because a handful of men had slipped through the lines wearing stolen uniforms.
In the field, the mood darkened. No one trusted anyone. A soldier's accent, his slang, even his choice of cigarettes could draw suspicion. One MP later said, "You could tell the Germans from the Yanks. They were too polite." Dozens of men were detained each day. Some were real Germans. Some were just unlucky Americans who didn't know the capital of Illinois. A private from Kansas was nearly shot when he said Jefferson City instead of Springfield. A lieutenant from New York spent 2 nights locked up because he couldn't remember who played shortstop for the Dodgers. The war had twisted into something new, a war of questions and answers, of accents and suspicion. A battle fought not just on the front lines, but in the minds of men. By Christmas Eve, the infiltration had nearly collapsed. The few German commandos still behind Allied lines were isolated, hungry, and terrified. They had succeeded in creating chaos, but that chaos had turned back on them. Every roadblock, every checkpoint, every baseball question was another trap waiting to close. And yet, their mission had already changed the course of the battle in one way. For days, American command had slowed its own movements, delayed its reinforcements, and second-guessed its own orders. The Germans hadn't stopped the Allies, but they had bought Hitler time. The kind of time men die for.
The trap closes. December 18th, 1944. The snow fell heavier now, blanketing the Ardennes in a deceptive calm. Behind that silence, the Allied army was turning on itself, every soldier a suspect, every jeep a possible trap. Checkpoints multiplied. MPs lined crossroads, rifles slung, and questions ready. The baseball test had become as feared as a firing squad. No one passed without proving they belonged to the flag they wore.
In a narrow road near Malmedy, a patrol of military police waited. Snow crunched under the tires of an approaching jeep. 4 men, all in American uniforms. The lead MP, Sergeant Bill McLean, raised his hand. "Hold it right there." The jeep stopped. The men inside looked cold and exhausted, their uniforms stained with mud, helmets tilted low. Everything looked right. Maybe too right. "Where are you headed?" McLean asked. "To Spa," the driver said quickly. "We've got dispatch orders from HQ." The MP frowned. Spa was under heavy shelling. He stepped closer. "You boys from what outfit?" 82nd, the driver replied, a little too fast. McLean's instincts prickled. He nodded slowly. 82nd, huh? Then tell me, who's your commanding general? The driver hesitated. Hodges. Wrong. It was James Gavin. McLean's hand dropped to his pistol. "Step out of the vehicle." The tension snapped like a wire. One of the passengers reached for his carbine, but before he could aim, the MPs opened fire. When the smoke cleared, 2 men lay dead in the snow, one wounded and one shouting surrender in a thick, broken accent. The survivor's name was Unteroffizier Manfred Pernaff, one of Skorzeny's hand-picked saboteurs. Under questioning, he confessed everything. They were part of Operation Greif, commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny. Their mission? Destroy bridges, misdirect Allied traffic, and create chaos behind the lines. McLean's men radioed in. The news spread like wildfire. Within hours, Allied intelligence had confirmation. The rumors were true. The Germans had been among them all along. Panic surged through the ranks. Now every report of odd accents or strange behavior felt like a knife twisting in the dark. The Americans responded the only way they knew, with discipline and fear. Suspects were rounded up across Belgium. Jeep after jeep stopped, papers checked, names cross-referenced, questions fired like bullets. A corporal near Eupen asked a suspected GI, "Who's the manager of the Detroit Tigers?" When the man stammered, soldiers ripped the jeep apart. Hidden maps of Allied positions fell from the seats. He wasn't American. Within 24 hours, dozens of infiltrators were captured. Some were still wearing the stolen uniforms. Others had tried to bury them in the snow. Too late.
At Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, the atmosphere turned electric. A new rumor arrived, one that chilled every man in the room. The infiltrators weren't just changing road signs. They had a new mission: assassinate General Eisenhower himself. The alarm spread instantly. Headquarters went on lockdown. Guards were doubled, every vehicle checked, every route changed without notice. Eisenhower's aides reported that he took the threat seriously, not because he feared for his life, but because he knew what it could do to morale. The idea that German assassins could reach the Supreme Commander's doorstep was enough to rattle an army already on edge. For the next 2 weeks, Eisenhower lived under near-house arrest. Armed guards patrolled his hallways. His car convoys moved without warning, headlights off. Every shadow became a suspect. One general later recalled, "Skorzeny's men didn't need to kill Ike to hurt us. The fear of it did the job." In the field, MPs faced a new kind of war. Not the clash of armies, but a chess match of minds. They began to develop subtle tricks to catch infiltrators. They'd ask how much a movie ticket cost in Chicago, who was married to the actress Rita Hayworth, or what the Chicago Cubs were known for. Each question was a test of cultural instinct, the kind that no German crash course in English could replicate. And so the net tightened. By December 22nd, the last of Skorzeny's main teams were hunted down. Some were caught at roadblocks, others by civilians who noticed strange American accents. A few managed to flee back through German lines, disguising themselves once more, this time as defeated men. Those who were captured faced grim justice. Under the Hague Convention, fighting in an enemy uniform was punishable by death. The Americans enforced it without hesitation. At Henri Chapelle, near the Belgian border, several captured infiltrators were lined up against a wall at dawn. They stood calm, faces pale, the false U.S. stars still painted on their jackets. A chaplain offered prayers. None spoke. Then rifles cracked through the morning air, echoing across the frozen fields. The uniforms they wore were American, but the blood that stained them was not. By Christmas Eve, the infiltration was over. Operation Greif had failed to achieve its grand goals, but it had succeeded in spreading terror through an army of millions. Skorzeny's handful of men had made the Allies question themselves. For days, suspicion paralyzed command decisions. Orders were delayed, convoys rerouted, reinforcements slowed. And though the German offensive would soon collapse, the psychological wound lingered. One intelligence officer wrote in his report, "They came in our clothes, speaking our tongue. For a moment the front wasn't just in Belgium. It was inside every man's head."
The confessions. The captured infiltrators were brought in under heavy guard, hands tied, eyes hollow, boots still caked with Ardennes mud. They were marched into makeshift interrogation rooms, barns, schoolhouses, even basements still echoing with artillery in the distance. Some refused to speak, others broke after the first question. They were soldiers, trained to die for their country, but not trained to wear another's skin. The Americans interrogated them one by one. Behind the desk, a single lamp cast long shadows across their faces. Name. Unit. Why are you wearing that uniform? The first prisoner, trembling, whispered, "We were told to confuse you, to change the signs. We are not killers, we only followed orders." He didn't meet the interrogator's eyes. When asked who had given the orders, every man spoke the same name, Otto Skorzeny. To the Americans, that name meant trouble. They already knew him, the tall, scar-faced commando who'd plucked Mussolini from a mountaintop in 1943, Hitler's favorite special forces officer. If Skorzeny was behind this, it wasn't just a prank, it was a campaign of psychological warfare. Over the next days, the pieces fell into place. Reports from all sectors matched. Teams of German soldiers dressed in perfect U.S. uniforms, dragging captured jeeps, planting explosives, flipping signposts, and redirecting entire convoys. The plan had been brilliantly simple and nearly worked. American intelligence officers pored over captured documents, lists of targets, maps, forged papers. They found English phrase books with notes scrolled in the margins. Don't say "ja," say "yeah." Cigarettes, ask for Lucky Strike. Movie star, Humphrey Bogart, not Bogart. It was all there, a crash course in American identity, enough to fool almost anyone for a few seconds. But a few seconds was all it took to plant chaos. In a debriefing report, one American officer wrote, "They fought with cunning, not courage, yet their effect was enormous. For a week, no one trusted anyone. Every driver, every dispatch, every soldier was a question mark." The confessions revealed that only 44 men had successfully made it behind Allied lines. 44, against hundreds of thousands of troops, and yet those 44 men had managed to throw the entire Western Front into confusion. They had redirected tanks into ambushes, cut telephone wires, even convinced a few artillery units to fire on their own positions. The damage wasn't catastrophic, but it was enough to slow the Allied advance by days, days that Hitler desperately needed. By Christmas Eve, the interrogations had slowed. Most of the captured men were executed. A few remained in Allied custody, kept alive for intelligence purposes. When one of them was asked what he thought of his mission, he replied quietly, "We were told it might end the war sooner, maybe even save Germany. I think now, it only killed us faster." The interrogator nodded. "You were never going to win. You just made everyone else afraid to look each other in the eye." The prisoner looked down. In that moment, the war wasn't about uniforms or sides. Just men, exhausted and broken, wondering what all the deception had been for. The Americans filed their reports. Operation Greif, confirmed. Skorzeny, still at large. The infiltrators, neutralized. The baseball questions, once a desperate improvisation,
had become legend. And somewhere, deep in the chaos of retreating German lines, Otto Skorzeny smiled grimly. His mission had failed militarily, but as a psychological weapon, it had left a scar no bullet ever could.
The price of deception. The winter sun rose weakly over the Ardennes. Snow fell on both the living and the dead, on tank tracks, on burned-out jeeps, and on the faces of men who could no longer tell friend from foe. The infiltrators had been caught, but their capture raised a question the Allies had never faced before. What happens to a soldier who fights the war in disguise? Under international law, specifically the Hague Convention of 1907, wearing an enemy uniform during combat was considered perfidy, an act of deception punishable by death. And so, even as the Battle of the Bulge raged on, quiet military tribunals were convened. In small, snow-covered villages, barns were turned into courtrooms. Wooden tables, a few candles, an American flag hung on the wall behind the judge's bench. The prisoners, most in their early 20s, stood trembling before American officers who'd seen too much to feel pity. They weren't monsters, they were soldiers following orders. But the rules of war demanded judgment. The charges were simple: operating behind enemy lines while wearing U.S. uniforms, sabotage, espionage. The sentence, if found guilty, was death by firing squad. The first trials began just before Christmas. Witnesses testified, American MPs who'd arrested the imposters, engineers whose trucks had been diverted into ambushes, and commanders who admitted that the infiltrators' tricks had nearly cost lives. One officer summed it up grimly: "These men didn't shoot from the shadows, they became the shadows." The defense was hopeless. The Germans argued that they had only worn U.S. uniforms to cross enemy lines, not to engage in combat. A fine legal distinction, but one that mattered little amid the chaos of war. On December 23, 1944, the verdict was read. 18 men were found guilty. Execution scheduled for dawn. The prisoners were led out into a clearing behind the camp. The snow crunched under their boots. They were calm, eerily calm. A chaplain offered prayers. A few asked for cigarettes. One whispered, "Tell my mother I did my duty." The firing squad took position. 12 rifles, 1 blank. The officer raised his hand. Ready? A deep breath. Aim. A moment of silence so pure it felt sacred. Fire. The shots echoed across the forest, bouncing off the frost-bitten trees. Then, silence again. The infiltrators fell, and with them, the most dangerous illusion of the Battle of the Bulge, the illusion that anyone could truly know who stood beside them.
Word of the executions spread fast. Among Allied ranks, it brought relief. Among German lines, it brought fear. For Otto Skorzeny, the man who had designed the operation, it brought something else: fame. His name became legend. To some Germans, he was a hero, the daring commando who'd fooled the Americans. To the Allies, he was a criminal mastermind, the face of Nazi deceit. But Skorzeny didn't die in the Ardennes. He slipped away, moving through collapsing German lines like a ghost. When the war ended, the Allies hunted him down. In 1947, he stood trial at Nuremberg. The charges? Wearing enemy uniforms, leading men in deception, violating the laws of war. The court was tense. Skorzeny defended himself with characteristic arrogance. Yes, my men wore U.S. uniforms, but only to infiltrate, never to fire. Even your own commandos used German uniforms in Normandy. To everyone's surprise, he was acquitted. The Allies couldn't prove he'd ordered direct combat while disguised. And so, Otto Skorzeny, Hitler's favorite commando, walked free. But the damage was already done.
His operation had left behind a ghost story in the American army, a lingering paranoia that no password, no uniform, and no friendly face could ever be trusted completely. Even after the war, veterans remembered the baseball questions, how a simple word like Yankees or Cubs had decided who lived and who died. And though the Germans' deception had failed militarily, it succeeded in one chilling way. It showed that in modern war, the line between soldier and spy could disappear overnight. The snow kept falling, on graves marked with crosses and on unmarked mounds where the infiltrators were buried. Two armies had fought each other across the Ardennes, but for a brief, terrifying moment, no one knew who the enemy really was.
Skorzeny's legacy. The war ended, but Otto Skorzeny's shadow didn't. Germany lay in ruins, cities smoldered. The Reich he had sworn to protect no longer existed. And yet, his legend, the man who had deceived the Americans themselves, only grew stronger. He had walked free from the Nuremberg trials, unrepentant, untouched, and unbroken. To his enemies, he was a criminal who had danced on the edge of dishonor. To his admirers, he was the future, the prototype of a new kind of warrior. A soldier who used disguise, misinformation, and psychology as weapons. Not bullets, not bombs, ideas. In the ashes of the Third Reich, Skorzeny found a new life. He slipped into Spain, under the protection of another dictator, Francisco Franco. There, in the warm Madrid sun, he built a new network. Some called it the Brotherhood. Others whispered it was the seed of Odessa, the rumored escape organization for Nazi officers. Whatever the name, Skorzeny's reach extended across continents. He trained ex-soldiers, mercenaries, and spies, men who would later fight in Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America, in secret wars where uniforms no longer mattered. But his most enduring legacy wasn't his freedom, it was his philosophy. In Operation Greif, he had proven something chilling, that fear, confusion, and doubt could paralyze an army faster than any weapon, that a few men with forged papers and perfect English could make thousands hesitate just long enough to lose a battle. The Allies took notice. Within a few years, Western intelligence agencies began studying Skorzeny's methods. In Washington, London, and Moscow, his tactics were quietly dissected. Military manuals began to include entire chapters on psychological warfare, misinformation, and identity deception. He had shown the world that modern war was not only fought in trenches, but in minds. By the 1950s, the Cold War had begun, and the ghosts of Operation Greif returned in new forms. Undercover agents crossed borders with false passports. Double agents infiltrated enemy embassies. Propaganda became a daily weapon.
The uniform was gone, replaced by a suit, a fake smile, and a story believable enough to pass for truth. In this new battlefield, Skorzeny's spirit lived on. Every spy who assumed a false identity, every operation that relied on misinformation, carried a piece of his legacy. Even NATO and the CIA, quietly, built units trained in deception to infiltrate, misdirect, and manipulate. The very same idea Skorzeny had unleashed in the Ardennes now shaped the wars of the future. In his later years, Skorzeny became something of a ghost himself. He was rumored to have worked with the Egyptian government, training commandos under Nasser. Later, whispers tied him to the Mossad, Israel's intelligence agency, in a secret deal for information on German scientists working for Egypt. True or not, one thing was clear. Otto Skorzeny had become a man with no country, a master of deception in life as he had been in war. When he finally died in 1975, his funeral drew hundreds of ex-soldiers, mercenaries, and admirers. They stood under Spanish sun, raising their arms in the old salute, not for Hitler,
but for the myth Skorzeny had become. A myth born from chaos and from one simple question asked by an American MP on a snowy Belgian road. Who won the World Series? Even decades later, the story of those infiltrators still sends chills through military academies, not because of how much damage they caused, but because of how close they came to changing everything. 44 men, a handful of jeeps, and a plan so simple it nearly broke the Allied front. They were defeated not by superior firepower, but by curiosity, by the human instinct to ask, to test, to doubt. And in that moment, when an American MP chose baseball over bullets, the U.S. Army learned the most important lesson of all. In war, truth isn't always what you see, it's what you believe.